Why has it gone back? Oh, right. Right. I hope this is going to work. Can you all? Oh no, you can't speak. The origins and causes of World War One. Well, as we all know, I think, the war began with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb. That's what we all know. And then after that, Austria eventually declared war on Serbia. So Russia declared war on Austria. So Germany declared war on Russia. Then France and etc. It just kept rolling on. So that's the how it began. But what we want to look at today is why it began.
I can't hear anything, it's just the first thing I've got.
Really?
Yeah. No.
In July 1914. But then Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia declared war on Austria, Germany declared war on Russia, etc., etc. So that's how it began. But what we want to look at is why it began. And here we have
the thing is, the way I see it, these days there's a war on, right? And ages ago there wasn't a war on, right? So there must have been a moment when there not being a war on went away, right? And there being a war on came along. So what I want to know is, how did we get from the one case of affairs to the other case of affairs?
Do you mean, how did the war start?
Yeah.
The war started because of the vile Hun and his villainous empire building.
George, the British Empire at present covers a quarter of the globe, while the German Empire consists of a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. I hardly think that we can be entirely absolved from blame on the imperialistic front.
Oh, no, sir, absolutely not. Mad as a bicycle.
I heard that it started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
I think you mean it started when the Archduke of Austro-Hungary got shot.
No, there was definitely an ostrich involved.
Well, possibly. But the real reason for the whole thing was that it was just too much effort not to have a war.
by gum, this is interesting. I always loved history. Oh, Battle of Hastings, Henry VIII and his 6 knives, all that.
You see, Baltic, in order to prevent war in Europe, 2 superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have 2 vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war.
But this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
Yes, that's right. You see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, sir?
It was bollocks.
Yeah, that's the Blackadder version of how the war started, which has become well known enough that a lot of people still think that. Historians, though, don't really like that because it's a simplistic view. So what we're going to do is look at the many factors that contributed towards the war. First, we'll look at all the background to the war, and then the historiography, so different versions of why it happened. So here's the contributory factors. There's European politics, nationalism, imperialism, economic rivalry, system of alliances, arms race. And you can add to that domestic politics as well. So first, we have the European politics. Congress of Vienna, 1815, 100 years before, after the defeat of Napoleon, a Congress was convened, and the idea was to provide a long-term peace plan for Europe. And what this sought to do is have a balance of power. So no one state would be dominant over the rest. Now, this especially suited Britain, who didn't want to get involved again in European wars because they wanted to concentrate on the empire. And but more fundamentally than that, the Congress also, although it wasn't stated, sought to inhibit republicanism and revolution, which had upended the old regimes in Europe and was still there bubbling under, and actually exploded in 1848. The next big event was the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. At the Congress of Vienna, Prussia gained territory, quite a bit of territory, and then it continued to expand in the 19th century. And the mastermind behind this was the Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. It soon became the dominant German state, because at that time there was lots of small states. But Prussia then had a short war with Austria, which confirmed that it was the strongest of the German states. And then Bismarck, through his diplomacy, if you can call it that, managed to manipulate Napoleon III, who was Emperor of France, into declaring war against Prussia. And then Prussia defeated France and proclaimed the German Empire in 1871, or the Second Reich as it was known. Then you had the Balkan Wars. In the second half of the 19th century, lots of states a few states had emerged in the formerly Ottoman-controlled Balkans. The Ottoman Empire was disintegrating a bit, and the European powers were all taking bits off it. Then in 1912, the Balkan League was formed by Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro as an alliance against the Ottoman Empire. Then they went to war with the Ottoman Empire, and it saw all 4 states expand their territory. And that war was ended by the Treaty of London in May 1913. But there was already disagreement. So in June 1913, the Second Balkan War began, when Bulgaria, who didn't think they got enough out of the treaty, attacked their former allies. And to cut a long story short, they ended up being defeated, because as Serbian and Greek armies went into Bulgaria, Romania decided it was a good time to attack from the north. So Bulgaria ended up asking for an armistice and losing territory. And even the Ottoman Empire took advantage and regained some of the territory it had lost previously. So not a good thing for Bulgaria. So here's Europe, 1815 to 1871. You can see Prussia was there after the Congress, and there's the German Empire after that. And the Balkans, that's the Balkans in 1871, and small Serbia and Romania. And then 1914 you had Albania and all these other states, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire down there, down to there. Right, the next thing to consider is imperialism. I think that's all. Oh, all right. That's Europe in 1914. That's just a general. You can see the layout of it all. So the next thing to consider is nationalism. In the Balkans, you have the new states. In Germany, the founding of the Second Reich. Austrian Empire, there was lots of ethnic tensions because of all the different makeup of the empire. And there was rivalry between different groups. In France, there was a proto-fascist nationalism that developed based on a reacquisition of Alsace-Lorraine, which the Germans had annexed in after the Franco-Prussian War, and basically it was boasting France's cultural superiority over everyone else. And there was an also complicating factor of a Catholic nationalism, which encouraged Germanophobia and promoted French imperialism as a fulfillment of a holy mission to civilize pagans and bring them to Christianity, which basically meant Africans, really. Then you had in Britain, you had the Irish Home Rule, Irish nationalism, which in 1914 looked like they were going to get home rule, except the Unionists in the north didn't like it and were arming. You had lots of invasion literature. This is books about Britain being invaded. And the invader at first was inevitably France or Russia or both. And it started with the Battle of Dorking, a book called the Battle of Dorking in 1871. And then towards the First World War, the invader changed to Germany. And English nationalism was closely linked with the notion of empire and Britain as a civilizing influence in the world. So then we go on to imperialism. That was the colonial empires in 1914. As you can see, the French had a lot of Africa, the British, the Germans, Belgian, Portuguese, we had India. So the empires were spread all over the world. And what you had is rivalry between the different empires. In Africa, the European countries plus the United States met in 1884 and agreed the rules of African colonization. No Africans were asked to attend this. And from then until 1914, there was conflict, mainly between European powers and native Africans and existing African states, sometimes between empires, and it ended up with what was known as the struggle for Africa. And most of Africa was carved up except for Ethiopia, which is there, and Liberia, which is there. And then you had in Asia, you had what was called the Great Game. And that was a political and diplomatic confrontation beginning in the 19th century and then only ended in the 20th between the British and Russian empires. Basically, the British were concerned about Russian expansion eastwards, and they saw it as a threat to India. So Britain tried to gain control over Afghanistan to make it a protectorate and act as a buffer state. And Russia wanted Afghanistan to be a neutral zone. This led to several wars, the first Anglo-Afghan War, which was a disaster, then two Anglo-Sikh wars, and the second Anglo-Afghan War. And it only ended in 1907 with the Anglo-Russian Convention. And later historians have doubted that Russia ever had designs on India. It was more a figment of the imagination of British diplomats. There's no actual proof. Russia was more interested in capturing Constantinople there, so they'd have the Straits of Bosphorus. So that's the scramble for Africa. That's Africa early on, and then you can see that it's totally controlled by Europeans. And then you have the Great Game, where you have the Russian Empire, the Indian Empire, and then slowly the British and Russian spheres of influence grow over here. So then we have domestic politics, which has come to more prominence recently. In Britain, you had industrial unrest for 4 years before the war and threats of a general strike. You also had the women's suffrage movement, which we know about, don't we? And we had Irish Home Rule, which we talked about is the prospects of a civil war in Ireland if Home Rule was given. In France, you had what was called La Belle Epoque, which was stable government and peace and economic prosperity, colonial expansion, and technological, scientific, and cultural innovations. But that was mainly preserved for the upper classes, and the rich in France sort of took themselves away from the reality of life and had this sort of frivolous fairy tale kind of existence, and people were judged on social standards alone. And inevitably there was a pushback, and the French unions started to move towards a more militant trade unionism called syndicalism, and which preached the social general strike to bring down the state. Then you had Germany. Germany was technically a democracy, but it was a weird combination of authoritarian rule with limited powers to the Reichstag, where the Kaiser could appoint ministers and they reported to him, and the Reichstag had limited powers over budgets, etc. And at the same time, they had the most advanced welfare program in the world, which was part of the plan of Bismarck, who saw it as a way of managing discontent. On top of that, you had the Prussian militarism, with the army more or less a law into itself. And at the same time, the biggest party was the Social Democratic Party, which, unlike these days, the Social Democratic Party is very moderate. In them days, they were Marxist. And then you had Kaiser Wilhelm, who was a bit of a loose cannon and a bit of, he was just Kaiser Wilhelm. He would just do things without thinking. So then you had the domestic politics of Austria-Hungary, and as you can see, there's all these different people, all these different languages, and so there was just so much ethnic tensions between different groups, and all looking for their own form of independence or autonomy. And then in Russia, they were defeated by Japan in 1904 in a war that they started and really thought they were going to win easily. That led to a revolution of 1905, which led to the formation of the Duma, like a parliament, and other concessions. But the Tsar Nicholas, who was probably the worst Tsar ever, and he'd rolled back those reforms one by one as the time went on. So by 1914, they were back where they started. And then you had a growing industrial working class as Russia industrialized, which was getting fed up with the conditions. And of course, you had the Rasputin, which just complicated things. Then you had Italy, the Risorgimento, which was a resurgence, which saw the unification of Italy in 1861. And then the capital was made in 1871. Rome was made the capital after the papal states were absorbed. But Italy always had unstable governments. You had quite liberal conservative, or the historical right, they called them. But they were often forced to bring in quite left-wing policies like nationalisation of the railways and such like. And you also had a radicalised working class, which culminated in Red Week in 1914, where there was mass strikes all over Italy. Ottoman Empire, major rifts were between ethnic groups, religious groups and regional groups. And then you had the competing ideologies of nationalism, decentralisation and pan-Islamism. And there was a group called the Young Turks overthrew the Sultan in 1908. And the idea was to introduce the democratic constitution. But then what they ended up with was a one-party state under what became known as the Three Pashas. And that was established in 1913. Then we go on to economics. You had the German industrial growth, where it outstripped Britain in many things, but that's just a couple of examples. Steel, where they shot ahead in the years from 1890 to 1913. And the other one is railway ridership, which is a sort of an indication of how advanced the country would be. And they were also very much advanced in chemical industries. That's where aspirin was discovered or formulated. And they had another thing that Bismarck had done is he had a state nationalised infrastructure. So everything was controlled by the state. Well, the infrastructure was controlled by the state, like the railways, etc. And British industry was outdated because it hadn't modernised, unlike the rest of Europe, who had started later. And then you had the other economic thing was the switch from coal to oil. So the British Navy decided to switch from coal to oil, which made Persia and Mesopotamia very, very important for the British. Because they wanted to control the oil fields there. In Russia, they were, as I said, they were industrialization, and that was mainly done with French money, especially in metallurgy. They sort of shot ahead in that. And at the same time, the Germans invested lots of money in the Ottoman Empire, built railways, etc. So you have a system of alliances coming up. In 1881, Bismarck, his main aim was to prevent Germany being encircled by enemies. So he came up with the League of the Three Emperors, which was an alliance between Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. This was always a bit shaky because Austria-Hungary and Russia both had designs on the Balkans. And so it was always prone to fall a bit. But Bismarck, being the diplomat he was, managed to hold it together. And then, of course, Kaiser Wilhelm comes on the throne and sacks him. And then the whole thing just falls apart. And Germany starts getting closer with Austria-Hungary. So then they formed the Triple Alliance with Italy. Now, Italy was always a not very enthusiastic partner in this because a lot of the Italians wanted Italy to include all Italian speakers, etc. And most of them lived in Austria-Hungary. So Russia, after being frozen out, started making diplomatic moves towards France. And as I said before, France was financing a lot of the industrialization. So they became the dual alliance. And that was basically a military alliance that said if one was attacked, the other one would come to their aid, which was basically an anti-German alliance. Well, it became an anti-German alliance. Originally, when it first started, it was actually anti-British because both France and Russia had issues with Britain. France with Britain in Africa and Russia with Britain in Asia. But then the British reached an entente with France, which wasn't an alliance. It was just an understanding about what would happen in Africa. And then they reached one with Russia about what's happening in Asia. So that became the Triple Entente, where you had a weird thing where France and Russia had a military alliance, but Britain had an understanding with both. So that's where you get the two power blocks in Europe. Now we come, and that leaves this in the Balkans. So you have Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. You have Germany with Austria and invested in the Ottoman Empire. Italy in alliance with Germany, but not quite. France an ally of Russia, and Britain doing treaties with both of them. So it all centered around the Balkans. You also had an arms race. Before the First World War, there was a naval arms race. It started really when the Kaiser, who was he wanted a big navy. He liked navies. He liked the British. He was sort of jealous of the British Navy, and there was others within Germany who also saw the need for a big navy. Now Germany had an overseas empire. So they started a naval arms race, building more and more ships. The only problem was, at the time, Britain could always outbuild the number. So by 1914, Britain still had over twice as many vessels as Germany. And basically, the Germans stopped in 1912. They realised that they couldn't carry on building the navy at the expense of the army, because they were still worried about Russia and France. Then you have the armies. As you can see, the armies were huge. Russia, nearly 6 million. France for Britain, Britain's figure actually includes all the people in India and all those other places. In Britain itself, it was much smaller, probably half that. But all the countries had the main countries had huge armies. And Britain was the odd one out because basically it depended on the navy. Britain's entire thing was to build a big navy, and if there was any trouble in Europe, then they'd get some other army to support them. So we come to the histography. Even before the war started, all the leaders were understanding the political importance of casting responsibility for the war on the other side, on the future enemies. So there was lots of moral claims from the outset, and pointing fingers at who's violating what and who's changing the norms of international politics and who's being aggressive. So that was even before the war started. When it did start, you had what was called the colour books. These were sort of diplomatic. Each country published these books, and they were all a different colour for each country. That's why they were called the colour books. And they were diplomatic papers. But the thing is that each country was very, very selective about what they put in their own book, because they'd leave out anything that made them look bad. And most of them came out pretty soon after the war started, within a month, except for the French one, which didn't come out till December, and is often considered the most unreliable because they had more time to fiddle about with stuff. And then the propaganda started. For the French, it was a case of civilization or barbarism, and the Germans are pictured as barbaric, and the civilization is France and Russia, funnily enough, which is a bit of a contradiction, but there you go. There was lots of secret diplomacy that was blamed, and you had the Germans and their propaganda were sort of Southern Austria against everybody else who was trying to bring us down. And then you also had people arguing it was a product of imperialism right from the beginning. This is a German anti-war poster from when the war started, but that was soon clamped down on, of course. Right, so then after the war was finished, of course, the Allies basically said it was the Germans' fault. They started it, they did it, it was all their fault, and we should punish them. Basically, that was the thing, and that was the Versailles Treaty, which meant that they could demand reparations off the Germans for the cost of the war. At the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, Bulgarians and Turks weren't actually invited to the peace talks, which is not the usual thing. You usually invite the people who got beat, and they were only invited at the end and more or less presented with the results and on a take it or leave it basis. So that was straight after the war. But then in the 1920s, you had others who were arguing that it was actually more Allied aggression and nationalism got out of hand that caused the war. And this was especially popular in America, who was trying to explain, because after the war, the Americans went into isolation. They didn't want anything to do with Europe. And of course, anything like that was picked up by German historians who went with it. And then again, you still had the imperialism. Socialist parties, Lenin wrote a book on it. They said it was all down to imperialism, the different nations trying to gain more territory, etc., etc. So the imperialism sort of carried on from the war years. And that more or less kept going until the 1960s. Before the 1960s, there was sort of, well, it was probably more Germany's fault, but some other countries could have done more to stop it, etc. But then a guy called Fritz Fischer, who was a German historian, came up with the Berlin War Party thesis, and that was that Germany always wanted to go to war, and that they were planning to go to war, and it was basically back to being their fault. And seeing this is from a German historian, it had a lot of pull. He went back to all the records and reread the diplomatic exchanges, and he said that there was a group in Germany who wanted war, basically before Russia could industrialize more, and to more or less for Germany to dominate Europe. And in doing so, they took what was the calculated risk, and that was that Britain would not enter the war. So, which failed, but that was the whole basis of the new theories. And added on to that, you had people like A.J.P. Taylor, who came up with the railway timetables theory, which basically said that once the Germans had started the war, they couldn't stop it because the railway timetables wouldn't let them. They couldn't, it was all planned out so far in advance that once it started, you couldn't stop it, even if they wanted to. So that was an extra one. But then you also got people who started looking at domestic politics again, and arguing that a lot of the countries did want to go to war to prevent problems at home, because there's nothing like a good war to unite the country behind you. In fact, that's one of the things that Tsar Nicholas actually did think. Unfortunately, it didn't work, or it only worked for a very short time. So that domestic politics and the unrest in each country was looked at again as sort of a counter to the Berlin War Party thesis. And then in the 1970s, at the height, just after the Vietnam War, you had a lot of looks at the First World War that started on the futile war theory, that previously people had said whose fault it was, but nobody questioned whether it was a just war or an unjust war. And this generation of historians started to look at it and said the whole thing was totally futile, and it was the fault of blind and arrogant leaders who whipped up what was called a war culture in each country. So people got into the mindset of wanting war because that was sort of proved how good their country was. And that carried on through the 1970s. And once again, people started looking at domestic politics, because some people went against the war culture and said, no, there was a lot of people who were still wanting change at home. So the two things were not exactly opposite, but they could be used together. And then you get to the 21st century. There's been a theory. I mean, when you got to the 21st century, it was coming up to the 100th anniversary. So suddenly there was lots of new books, lots of new research. The people started to go back to the original sources. And one theory was that it was the Austro-Hungarian elites who wanted the war, who manoeuvred Germany into it with them, because they basically wanted to take over the Balkans, and they thought that if Germany was behind them, Russia would not intervene. Another theory was it was actually a secret German Austro-Hungarian plan, with certain elements in both countries working together to do exactly the same thing. Then there's a sleepwalking into war theory, which is more that nobody really wanted the war, but it's just sort of happened and they didn't realise it was happening until it was too late. That it was more or less a failure of diplomacy, that the diplomats were playing games which led to the war, because they didn't realize the consequences of what they were doing. And allied to this is another theory that has emerged recently, that British duplicity encouraged what happened, because the British the theory goes that the British's natural ally would have been Germany, but there was a group in the Foreign Office who were very anti-German, and they started to they did make secret plans, because the sources have come out, with France to back the military. And as I said, the Entente was not a military alliance as such. And this led to the British Foreign Secretary not being honest about what Britain was going to do, because Britain, I was sort of taught that Britain had to go to war because of Belgian neutrality when Germany invaded, but actually the treaty doesn't say that. That's just one interpretation of it. Britain did not have to go to war for Belgium, and the majority of the cabinet at the time were against it. But it came out that the secret negotiations between the British and French, more or less the military negotiations, made it a sort of fait accompli. And you had 4 people in the cabinet who were very pro-war. One was the Foreign Secretary, whose name escapes me. One was the War Secretary, and the other 2 were the Prime Minister, Asquith, and the First Lord of the Admiralty, who was Winston Churchill. They 4 of them worked together to manoeuvre the rest of the cabinet into a war situation. That's the theory, and that if Britain would have been clearer with the Germans that they were going to get involved, then the Germans may not have invaded. That's the theory anyway. So, and like I said, all these different theories are just that, the theories. Nobody agrees. I think the consensus is now that it wasn't just the Germans' fault, and that what people look at now is all the social factors, and they start to look at world situation, the fact that Britain had an alliance with Japan at the time, and that part of that, the reason for that alliance on the British part was so the Japanese Navy, which had been built in Britain, and the Japanese naval people had been trained in Britain, they could take care of the Pacific against the Russians, and leave Britain not needing to put as many ships out there. And for the Japanese, it gave them the kudos to claim to become a world power. So the people have started looking at the whole world situation, and they've added in social factors and everything. So, but it's still up in the air. Nobody seems to agree exactly why, and I don't suppose we're going to come up with it now, but we'll see. So, and this is the end. There we go.
Wow. Fantastic. Really excellent. Thank you. So much work gone into that.